Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast. You can find out more about the presenters by going to scottishhousingpod.com, and you can also follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok and Facebook. Just look up at Scottish Housing Pod.
The Scottish Housing Podcast is brought to you in partnership with Indigo Square, 2010 Consultancy, and the Right Business Centre.
So we are joined now by John Boughton, who I'm going to embarrass him slightly by immediately calling him one of the preeminent experts on social housing. When people say he's written the book, John literally has written the book on social housing. So John, I'm going to let you do the better introduction than I can do about who you are, what your knowledge is about this sector, and why we've asked you to come on the podcast. So off after you, John.
Well, thank you. And I'm suitably embarrassed by that introduction, but grateful. So why have I become, I hope, an expert on council housing, as I will still call it, rather than social housing? I think really from two principal strands. One is that I'm a social historian, and actually council housing has been a huge part of our shared history, and I think it's less the case now, but for a long time it was a strangely kind of neglected and marginalised, often denigrated part of our history. So in that sense, as a historian, I wanted to give that history back to the many millions of people who lived in council housing. 1 in 3 almost in England and Wales at peak in 1980, over 50% in Scotland. So obviously it's a pretty big deal. I was also briefly a local councillor, so obviously I have a political interest in housing, which was one of local government's principal functions. And then just to kind of bring it to specifics, I started a blog in 2013 called Municipal Dreams, and that was intended to be a sort of record of local government reform and achievement over the last century or so. And that really took off, got a lot of views and interest, and increasingly, and it focused on council housing, because as I've mentioned already, council housing really was, in many respects, the primary function of district councils in particular. So, over time, without the intention of writing books or anything like that blog took off, and a couple of books have emerged from that process. But essentially, I just think it's a really important history, and one that I want to celebrate, not with rose-tinted spectacles, but with due celebration and awareness of where things went wrong and the steps that were taken.
So you wrote 2 books, the municipal that I could, know of. You might be able to tell me you've done even more. There was the Municipal Dreams, and then there was a history of council housing in 100 estates, which, is taking you around all the council house estates in the UK. So, we're going to touch on some of those, but I think it'd be useful to go right back to the beginning for the listener. So, from my perspective, digging in the depths of time, of memory, of doing history at school, there was we're going to build homes for heroes. And there was the 1919 Housing Act. Is that pretty much where council housing starts in the UK?
Well, it's a pretty good start. And obviously we celebrated the centenary of that fairly recently, and that was often what was said, broadly speaking correctly. But I would take it back just a few decades previously. So essentially, of course, you're looking at the Industrial Revolution, you're looking at rapid industrialization, looking at a huge and rapid pace of urbanization, and the growth of major cities. And they didn't necessarily worsen working class housing conditions, but what they did do was create very concentrated poverty and slumdom in such a way as by the end of the 19th century, that was really came to the attention of the British political classes. So basically, council housing begins legislatively with the 1890 Housing of the Working Classes Act. And what were the kind of motives behind that? Well, there was genuine humanitarian concern. There was a lot of exposés and even statistical record of just how severe those housing conditions were. There was pressure from below, a nascent labour movement, a growing trade union movement. But essentially, in my view, somewhat cynically perhaps, what really mattered was the view of the Victorian upper classes, because they were the people that had political power in this era. And they were concerned about disease that would not necessarily confine itself to poor working class areas. They were concerned about disorder, criminality, alleged immorality of these working class slums. And they became increasingly concerned about something they called national efficiency by the turn of the century. And this was the belief that the British working class was unable or unfit to compete economically or militarily with essentially at that time the sort of rising threat of rival powers such as Germany in particular. So I think that's the kind of combination of factors that led to council housing emerging in the 1890s. You have about 24,000 council houses built across the country, across the UK, before 1914. But as you quite rightly say, in 1919, the impact of the First World War was the great sea change. Lloyd George promises a land fit for heroes. He promises to build 500,000 new homes. The 1919 Housing Act is a huge breakthrough piece of legislation. It requires local government not only to, well, firstly to survey local housing needs, but to prepare a plan to meet them where necessary, which it invariably was. So the 1919 Housing Act was really the great legislative landmark. And between the wars, 1.1 million council homes were built across the country.
Very interesting. So we have this boom. What was the sort of standard? I mean, obviously, we're based here in Glasgow. We've got a load of pre-1919 properties. I think Scotland in total's got about 500,000 pre-1919 properties, and they were all sandstones. What was the standard and quality of the housing that was built in that post-1919 period? Was it something that we should be proud of, or did it need a great leap forward?
But it's a mixed record. Obviously, 1919, these homes for heroes, as they became known as, were to a very high standard. They were built according to built and designed according to the recommendations of the Tudor Walters Report, which applied both to England and Wales and Scotland. And that set very high standards of housing design, space standards, facilities, etc. Standards which weren't really actually replicated again until after the Second World War. So those were, that was high quality housing. It was also very expensive housing. It cost about 3 times as much as equivalent pre-First World War building. And so in 1921 we have austerity. We have what was called the Geddes Act and spending cuts, essentially. And so that program is axed. And subsequent legislation, 1923, 1924, and so on, sees reduced standards. Although I will give a shout out at this point to the 1924 Housing Act, which of course was really the kind of child of John Wheatley, Clydeside MP, and that actually contributed over 500,000 new council homes in the interwar period. In terms of standards, although I've talked about the kind of decline post 1919, one always has to remember, and this is uniformly the case, that council houses were a step up. They were a massive step up to the slum conditions, tenement housing that most working class people had known previously. So you get this kind of phrase repeated time and time again. It's a phrase of its time, I guess. But, people in Glasgow, people in London talking about, well, it was like moving into Buckingham Palace. So, running to the taps, turning on the hot water, enjoying the bedrooms and so on. So always better, because it was impossible almost to actually build down to the level of contemporary slum housing.
John, I'm maybe going to interrupt the thread of working our way through the social history of what we call social housing today, but council housing, as you rightly point out, by asking you to give a wee observation, and maybe I'm also about to ask you to take your historian hat off, and maybe, well, it's not take your historian hat off, with a historical perspective, a political view, but you mentioned your own political background as well. Do you see any parallels today with that Victorian period that you spoke about, when the Victorian upper classes were driven by whatever their particular concerns were in terms of the housing conditions that the working class were then living in, to what a part of today's working class, because the working class is very different today and is more diverse. But is there a parallel with today's conditions around some of the housing conditions that people are living in, or the lack of housing and lack of housing choice, with the perceived immorality in certain areas of the country or schemes, and that national efficiency? Is there parallels today that's specific to housing, do you think?
Well, I think the upper class has always been prone to moral panics, and we saw that in the sort of 1890s, and we will see that today, of course. I mean, I think there are two kind of ways of responding to your question, if I understood it correctly. One is, obviously, that there were, I think less so now, but certainly, what emerges in the 1970s and 80s and 90s is a criticism of housing estates, council estates. They are viewed as areas of, negatively and pejoratively by people who didn't know better, but they were viewed as sort of centres of, immoral and criminal behaviour. So there was a sort of a shift in perception of council housing at that stage, and council estates in particular. So there's that element. I would like to think we've moved beyond that slightly nowadays, because obviously conditions have changed, and hopefully perceptions have become more sensitive and educated around that topic. Where I think there is and should be cause for concern, genuine cause for concern from the political classes, is of course the current housing crisis, the current housing situation, where we have so many people living in temporary accommodation. We have a private rental sector which is, unregulated. We have good landlords, of course, but too much low quality private rental sector housing with quite poor conditions. So I think, if we look at housing in the round currently, we see now, of course, we're back to this situation, I think, where we're looking at social housing as a necessary solution to the failings, some of the failings, at least at the lower end of the market, of the private rental sector.
Thanks. So one of the things, obviously, that people are aware of, and obviously Stephen's touched on there, that's coming out of that post-war period, post-Second World War period, is, I think most people, if you'd talk about council housing, they would immediately then say, right, that was part of the general ethos of the welfare state, that we then had this massive boom in social housing. I mean, most of us either grew up in, or a family grew up in, council housing. That's where the majority of the population lived, and probably the majority of people listen to this. So do you want to talk us through, because obviously that really hit the really massive housing boom through the 50s, 60s, and then things started to happen in the 70s. So do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah. It's a great topic, and I'm glad you kind of prefaced it in the way that you did, because it's often forgotten, maybe less so in Scotland. But by most accounts, or by serious accounts, 1 in 2 of the British population born in the early post-war period spent part of their lives, at least, in council housing. So, as I said at the start, it's a huge part of our shared history and personal experience. And the Second World War, even more than the First World War, had a huge impact. So if you go to the sort of beginning of that, I suppose, you can look at a coalition white paper. This is when Churchill was Prime Minister, Attlee was Deputy Prime Minister. And in 1945, the coalition government estimated we needed 750,000 new homes in the UK. And they, for the first time, they accepted the principle that there should be, quote, a separate dwelling for each family desiring of one. So this was the kind of raised expectations and aspirations of post-45. So 750,000 new homes, then that was to replace existing homes which had been damaged during the war or severely neglected and deteriorated through the war. On top of that, 500,000 new homes to replace existing slum housing. So this was the scale of the task, this was the scale of the ambition in 1945. And of course, we had at that point the first majority Labour government and now governed Minister of Health and Housing. And in periods of genuine austerity, real economic difficulty, that Labour government built 805,000 new council homes before 1951. But I would like to point out when I'm speaking about council housing that the highest number of council houses built in a single year were completed by a Tory government. Harold Macmillan was Minister of Local Government at that time, and that Tory government in 1953 built 229,000 council homes in a single year. So this was the scale of what we sought to achieve in the post-war period. And, the context for this, so if we look at history, we can see 45 into the mid-50s is basically replacement. It's kind of it's building new homes, of course, but essentially it's homes that replace damaged and deteriorated housing from wartime. From the mid-50s is a new ambition, a shared ambition, a cross-party ambition, which is really, to use the language today, to eradicate the scourge of the slums. Permanently eradicate the scourge of the slums. And it's worth remembering that, in 1950, only 35% of Scottish households had their own bathroom. At the same time, 54% of homes across the country lacked a bathroom. So, this is the slum housing, and this was the aspiration that slum housing would be removed forever from the 1950s into 1960s, and you get into that era of mass public housing, some of which was later criticised for its scale and nature. But the context is, let's clear the slums, let's house people decently.
I think the other context is, again, I'm picking up on a political point, but I think the other context is an important one that you identify is there was a cross-party consensus on what was a kind of post-war, I'm not sure this is the language that was used at that time, a kind of national mission to rebuild the country and rebuild its people, and to do it in a different way, a new normal. Language that was used during the COVID period here about there'll be a new normal and we'll all be in this together, which I'm not sure. I think it was all kind of forgotten after COVID because we were too busy worrying about parties or whatever. But there was a consensus about building houses for people, but taking out people out of slum conditions. There was a consensus about a decent basic national health service, about a welfare state as a safety net. All of these things and the motivations of different political parties might have been different, but the point was there was a consensus about that national mission. And I wonder again if today that consensus has been lost. I think you're right to say earlier that I hope to goodness all the past prejudice about council house estates, for example, is not something that most people would hold. But I actually wonder if there's an inbuilt prejudice in both our main political parties in the United Kingdom about what kind of housing should be part of the national mission today. And sometimes I despair, even as a reasonably kind of centre ground moderate person, that only the free market and only the building of private houses is seen as something worthy of a national consensus. And even then there's not always a consensus between the parties. I'm maybe on my soapbox just now, but you just pricked a wee thing in me there, which was, there was a real consensus about it was that Butler-Gates-like kind of consensus about a whole number of things, wasn't it, that dominated British politics in the Second World War period right through into the 70s. And it was only really, I suppose, when we got to those difficult decisions about what to do as industry was changing, deindustrialisation, that consensus began to break up. And I'm sure we'll come on to that because of course housing was related to that, to how the world changed at deindustrialisation. But I just wonder if there's again something we could learn our political leaders today, our political classes, who are kind of the equivalent of the Victorian upper classes in some ways today, could learn from that post-war political consensus cross-party, as you described it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's an analysis that I recognise and broadly endorse. I think pretty closely endorsed, to be honest. In 1951, the Conservative Manifesto criticised Labour's housing record for not building enough social housing, council housing, amongst other things. Described housing as the first of social services. Let's clear the slums was actually one of the electoral slogans of that 1951 Conservative Party. So yes, there's definitely a broad consensus. In the 1960s, there was a really kind of a political arms race. In 1963, the Conservative government pledges to build 350,000 new homes a year, including obviously council houses at that time. And the Labour opposition promises 400,000 goes up to 500,000. So that's the kind of priority given to housing at that time. I actually say, I mean, it raises a big question, and perhaps we'll talk about that more, about what changes, I guess, in the 70s, as you identify. But I do regret the fact that most parties, and I include what I will own up to being my party, the Labour Party, I regret the fact that both parties are ignorant about the need and actually the priority that should be accorded to social housing. So obviously owner occupation is a vital part of any kind of functioning housing market. It's certainly something that many people aspire to. But what we know, what we've learned from the last 40 years, is that actually for a viable housing market, the one that works for all its people, as it were, we need social housing in good numbers to meet that cross-section of needs. And I do regret that we're not making the argument more forcefully, although I hope in practice it will be implemented both by a Westminster government, and I know, to be fair, that the Scottish government has given higher priority to social housing and has a pretty good record, relatively speaking, on providing social housing in recent years.
Yep. You mentioned something there, Stephen, and you mentioned it, touched on it as well, John, about obviously if you've then got a race to build a lot of houses, that's when you might start to make mistakes in what you build. And it's one of the things, the historian Dominic Sambrook, because obviously one of the biggest changes in Britain is the right to buy. And the historian Dominic Sambrook talks about the type of concrete jungle developments that were built in lots of our cities. And so we're sitting here in Glasgow. Glasgow had a 50-year plan, pretty much starting in the centre, to get rid of all the housing and rebuild it. If you look at the models from Glasgow's 50-year plan, they do look like something. They do look like something that either Stalin or the Nazi Party would have built, in terms of it was very everything's grid-like, square and whatever. But Dominic Sambrook's point is that 60s concrete jungle stuff that was built because the sort of political elite's attitude of, we know best, we're going to build what's best for you, and this is what's best for you to be able to fit our need to build this number of houses. His argument is partly that started to build the mistrust in people and started to sow the seeds of council housing, social housing isn't a positive. It started to sow the seeds of negativity around council housing. And his argument is that rather than a lot of the perception that Margaret Thatcher then changed Britain with the right to buy legislation in 1980 when she came into power in 79 and then the bill in 80. All she was doing was riding the tidal wave of public opinion. I think it was something like 84% of public in the 70s were in favour of the principle of being able to buy your council house off the council. And all she was doing was riding that wave of public sentiment, and the mistrust had been sowed by us building not great housing equally at the same time as in our big cities we'd built some not great housing. In some of the new towns we built really nice housing, and so we'd shown people what could be done. And so I don't know what your thoughts are on that, John, that really there was a mixture of what we built in the 60s, sowed the seed for what ended up being the right to buy mood of getting out and own your own thing and having you have the right to own and do what you want with your property, and it's not determined by the council. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, see, just before John answers that, can I just say that if that is an example of Margaret Thatcher riding the back of public opinion, it's the first and only example I've heard of her of being a populist leader during her period. Sorry, John.
But right to buy was a popular policy.
It was, yeah.
But just to be personal.
Yeah, I suppose that's true, yeah.
When I was canvassing for the Labour Party in 1983, we were going around North Norfolk, that's where I lived, North Norfolk council estates, explaining why we opposed right to buy, and we didn't get a very good reception, and we didn't do very well in that election. So it was a popular policy, there's no doubt about that, and it was popular in England and Wales and very popular in Scotland, despite its Scotland's allegedly more left-wing tradition. So,
well, exactly, including in this red Clydeside city of Glasgow, absolutely. The place of Wheatley, yep, absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, going back to that question, I mean, it's an interesting one. I mean, yes. The short answer is to agree with what you say. I mean, as a historian, and not Dominic Sambrook, I would like to unpack that further. I think there's more to be said and more nuance to be added. There's also, first of all, it's actually worth remembering that, and you kind of alluded to this, that 2/3 of council housing across the UK between 45 and 1979 was 2-storey traditional homes. So actually, and the only time, and this is in Scotland, for example, the only time where, at peak, high-rise, about 5-6 stories above that, peaked at 25% in 1965. So for all the kind of popular perception and understandable perception, given, we live in Glasgow, we live in London, we see the high-rise. Actually, most council housing was precisely that quote-unquote decent family housing that most people, many people prefer. But it is the case, of course, and I mean, Glasgow is an example. Donald Gibson, of course, wanted to build housing. He was unabashed in proclaiming, let's get rid of the slums, let's build high to do that. And there clearly were missteps. I mean, the Red Road flats is always the kind of iconic example of that, isn't it? 32 stories high. At most, 28, 32 stories high, probably quite good housing in and of itself, always superior. These flats, these tenements were always superior to where people were moving from. But of course, built without sufficient community infrastructure, built in a sort of detached and isolated way. And that was common to a number of these kind of high-rise developments, and one of the reasons why they became unpopular. So, and of course, the other element that in the later 60s was system building, which was championed by both the Conservative Party. Keith Joseph was the housing minister in the early 60s, great proponent of system-built council housing, but actually accelerated under the Labour government from 1964. And system building, as implemented, i.e. forms of prefabrication and so on, was very poorly implemented for the most part in the UK. And so that, of course, created its own problems and deficiencies. So you have that, so you definitely had a kind of overweening scale ambition, and you certainly had some, I mean, I avoid the phrase concrete jungle, but in terms of sort of media portrayal, and popular perception to some degree, that's what emerged from that kind of over ambition. of the 1960s, mass public housing era of that element. And what I would say, and if I sorry to go on so much, but what I would add to that is, in fact, there was a backlash by the late 60s. There was obviously a backlash against system building, because we had in London the Ronan Point disaster, which was the collapse of a system built tower block. But there was also a realization that actually high-rise wasn't housing people at greater density, because you need more space, you need to avoid overshadowing and so on. So actually, these tower blocks weren't providing housing at a higher density than traditional lower story housing. And also, they were very expensive to build. Relatively speaking, they were more expensive than sort of equivalent housing at low level. So from 68, you definitely have this shift. And in the 1970s, I would argue, and this is kind of gets overshadowed by what comes next. But if you look at the 1970s, you look at the kind of quality of council housing, almost low-rise, high-density council housing was the kind of name of the game in the 1970s. And you have some really high-quality architect-designed council housing in that era. And to my mind, it was a bit of a golden age. It was a corrective to some of the mistakes of the 1960s, and it promised great things for the future had we continued along that path. But as we've mentioned already, a lot of things changed in 1979.
Yes, so the change in 79, and again, from just being involved in housing, but not on the social housing side, it really looks like 1979, the Conservative Party come in, 1980, legislation comes in allowing people to buy their housing. And from that point, the UK's priority, and when I say UK, I'm talking about as a whole, has been that we are owner-occupiers. I mean, Scotland's settled down now to about 60% of our population are owner-occupiers. It's been like that now for about 20 years. But pretty much, that's where we've settled down. But of course now we're seeing increasingly, I mean, I was down in London at the weekend and was commenting to a friend that I met down here, does everybody in London now live in a 2-bedroom flat? Because that's all there appears to be. If you travel anywhere within a 5-6 mile radius of the centre of London, it is just flats and more flats getting built, for private housing in general. But there's talk of a housing crisis in London and major cities across Europe. People are talking about housing crisis, but housing crisis in London with the cost of housing, average house price over $500,000, first time buyer price of 400 grand. In Scotland, we've had 4 councils declare a housing emergency, although Stephen and I are still trying to get to the bottom of what does that actually mean, apart from you've declared a housing emergency. And all of that is coming from a legacy of not building enough affordable housing. Basically, council housing, social housing has gone out with the right to buy, and not enough supplies come in. So where are we at? I'm just conscious of time and everything. Where are we at now in terms of council housing? What's the attitude to how we turn this around and what we do? As increasingly people are seeing that it can't all be the private sector. In fact, in Scotland, we've just had Stuart Milne go out of business and a number of house builders raising concerns about their lack of ability to do new build starts. So where are we now?
Yeah, well, we're not in a good place, but maybe we're in a better place than we have been, very relatively speaking. Yes, I mean, as you say, obviously, right to buy, we lost millions of council homes across the country. We were barely replacing them. In fact, we still, in England and Wales, are still suffering a net loss of council housing on an annual basis, simply through the impact of right to buy. So our housing stock is diminishing. Now, I know Scotland has, as we said already, has since housing has become a devolved matter, has had a more progressive policy on this. Has been building more social housing. I actually have some statistics. I was interested to actually look at this. So actually in 2022, 2023, apparently, just something over 12,000 social rent homes were built in Scotland. In England and Wales, the figure was 8,000. So obviously that's quite impressive, relatively speaking, in Scottish terms.
So just clarify, what was the England and Wales number?
Social rent. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so to give listeners some context, Scotland's population is about 8% of the UK population. So really, if the numbers were equal, 120,000 houses would be getting built roughly in England and Wales to keep track of, to be on a like for like basis with the number built in Scotland. That's an incredible difference.
Yes, I'll trust that maths to you. But yes, that is telling. And I will throw another statistic at you, which is that between 1945 and 1979, we were building, as a country as a whole, 126,000 council homes annually, on average. So this is the contrast. 12,000, 8,000 compared, 20,000 in total, say, compared to 126,000 built in that earlier era. And it's creating massive problems. So obviously, circling back to where we started, in terms of this question, there is a realisation, both in Scotland but also in England and Wales, that we need to be building more council houses. They're necessary. There is in English and Welsh terms, in English terms, certainly there's inadequate support. Now, obviously, the Conservative government talks about affordable homes, talks about home ownership still as the goal, talks about support for 100% mortgages and so on, Help to Buy. So that has been the kind of record of the Conservative government for the last decade or so. And until there's a change of policy, maybe a change of government, we're probably not going to see that change very much. But the fact is that we need more social housing and we need central government support to enable actually local councils, local authorities of all stripes who want to build social rent housing at greater scale. There is an ambition there. I think there's a growing understanding that it's necessary. But as in 1919, as in 1945, we need, the political key change and the changed priorities to allow that to happen.
Yeah, it needs to be part of a greater national mission, doesn't it? Back to the description in post-Second World War, that was, because it was widening about housing, back to the description that you talked about, and the height of the Victorian classes being concerned before that point in 1919, that many of us tend to think was the real turning point. Are there any examples just now that you know of in England, geographically, council-wise, that are further ahead in any of this agenda, or is it all very difficult because there's a lack of national support?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, actually, there's some very good data out there, and I can't recall it to my mind immediately. But actually, the number of local councils engaged in housing provision, broadly defined, is very large in England and Wales. But they do so under very straitened circumstances. Within that, so in other words, they're using a whole variety of means to provide housing. So that's public-private partnership, that's their own private housing companies, that's obviously housing associations. So it's sort of, 100 flowers bloom. In the 45-79 period, it was a very simple model councils built. They were supported by central government to do so. Nowadays, we're forced into this kind of very complex financial equation, which allows some councils to build some housing. Within that, some councils have got very good record. I'm in London at the moment. Camden has a very good housing record, but Camden has lots of land, lots of expensive land. So when it wants to build housing, it builds council housing. It builds homes for sale at the same time. It's a cross-subsidy model. And councils are using Section 106, which I'm not sure if that operates in Scotland in the same way. Section 106 is the requirement that developers also fund social infrastructure as a result of their private developments.
Yeah, but we have an equivalent section. I think it's section 75.
75, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So section 75, obviously these things are harnessed in order to build some social housing, or in fact to maintain and improve existing social housing, public-private partnership, cross-subsidy, and so on. We are building housing at that smaller scale, the larger scale than hitherto in the last few decades. But in my mind, until we have that direct government support, and I don't like to use the word subsidy because to my mind it's not subsidy, it's an investment which pays for itself many times over. But until we have that central government investment in social housing, we're not going to see the numbers that we need.
So I'm a great believer that there's really nothing new in this world. That, technology, how we do things might be new in terms of technology or the like, but I think we maybe just have to get our political classes to really understand what those Victorian upper classes understood in the late, last century, but one that actually tackling housing as a national mission is wider than just about housing people, important as that is.
Yep, I'm also a Back to the Future guy, and there's certain things which we're not kind of allowed to say now, but actually that model, not perfectly implemented at all times, as we've discussed, but actually that model was a hugely effective, cost-efficient way of providing housing for people that needed it. And I really do hope that we can learn from that past in order to build a future.
I'm so too. Last question from me before Brian wraps up. Do you have the same description south of the border as we have in Glasgow? Anyway, I don't know if it's in the rest of Scotland, but it became a great ambition of people that had come out of pretty slum housing conditions into their equivalent of Buckingham Palace, as you said earlier. Once they were in those houses, their next ambition was to get into a back and front door. And by a back and front door, it meant, you had your own front door and a back door into a wee garden. And that, as I was growing up, was a great ambition of many people. Do you have that description south of the border about a back and front door?
Front door, no, I've not heard that before, but absolutely, what was described as the cottage home, front and back garden. I mean, this is the perennial kind of ideal of most housing reformers. It comes from a kind of garden city arts and crafts tradition, of course, again from the later 19th century. Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City movement, and so on. So if you look at the kind of early demands, absolutely, they were cottage homes, cottage suburbs, gardens front and back, huge pride in those gardens, maintained by the husband, getting away from the wife in the house, whatever. So that kind of that domestic bliss was aspired to. Yes, I think across the country, across the UK.
Yeah, and people just really thought they were toffs when we were in houses like that. It just did.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember I used to sell when I first started working in a estate agency. That was the first time I came across that. You'd be speaking to people in the East End, moving from a flat, and they'd be telling you with great pride that they were moving to a house with a front and back door, because that's what people want. They want a bit of outdoor space, which, final thing just to touch on, today as we record this, there's a new housing bill, white paper being launched in Scotland. A lot of it is about restrictions, or not restrictions, maybe the wrong word, but certainly trying to deal with the private rented sector to give greater security of tenure and living rights to people in the private rented sector. Now, I was just on the radio. My point was, for me, as someone who works in the private sector, they're trying to control the private sector and make it more like public sector housing. The simplest way to resolve that is not necessarily to control the private sector. The private sector's grown because it's filled a void because we don't have enough social housing. I don't know if you agree, John. For me, they're only having to do this legislation because for 20 years we've not built enough social housing. Am I being too simplistic? Is the solution we just need to build more social housing? Then we don't need to control private housing, because private housing for me has a different place should have a different place in the modern world of It's the students, it's the young first-time buyer type person before they become a first-time buyer. It's that intermediate step. It shouldn't be people's long-term tenure of necessity.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. I mean, I definitely think supply of affordable, genuinely affordable homes within the public sector is a huge part of the problem you described so far as the private rental sector is concerned, because it was virtually dead, and maybe or very, very diminished by the 1980s. But of course, nowadays, you say, it's housing increasing numbers of people unsuitably in terms of their needs and aspirations. That's absolutely the case. So I do think we need to reforms regarding security of tenure and health and safety. I think we do need regulation of the private rental sector like that. Private rental sector works effectively across the continent where it has been, reasonably supervised, as it were. But I also agree that in terms of longer term housing for a range of needs, yes, public housing, social rent housing is the kind of missing element, the missing piece of this jigsaw that is required in actually a viable and effective housing market that serves, again, that cross section of needs that we started with.
Okay, well, conscious of your time and Stephen's time, so that's been fantastic, John. I'm going to stick a lot of my stats. So your statistic about the number of social houses built in England and Wales, that's pocketed away. I'm going to be playing that card for quite some time. And I will say, John Boughton, thanks very much.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast with Stephen Purcell and me, Brian Gilmore. To ensure you don't miss an episode, please follow us and subscribe wherever you pick up your podcasts. To find out more about the presenters, go to scottishhousingpod.com, and to get all the latest information about forthcoming guests and new episodes, follow us on social media at Scottish Housing Pod.
The Scottish Housing Podcast is brought to you by Indigo Square. Whether you are a landlord looking for a letting agent to help you navigate through all the legislative changes, or a homeowner needing an expert to manage common building repairs. With offices in Glasgow and Ayrshire, Indigo Square are your perfect property partner. Contact us today at indigolets.com. At the Right Business Center, we're passionate not just about business, but about helping businesses succeed. We offer high-quality offices and small workshop units with easy access to the M8 at Junction 11, opposite the Fort, Glasgow. Discover premium services at Right Business Center, from dedicated support to 24/7 workspace access. Tailored services, including reception support, concierge service, and comprehensive solutions, prioritize efficiency for your business success. Right Business Center is owned by Gym Workspaces, a not-for-profit charity which has been offering premises to rent to the business community since 1987. Whether a startup or established business, go to rightbusinesscenter.co.uk to find out how your company can benefit from a new home.